Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for the story tonight, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Oh, there you are, Mr. Reynolds, I said warmly. You're up bright and early, aren't you? You know what they say, early bird catches the worm. I could see Mr. Reynolds sitting down on the couch, seemingly staring rather vacuously into space. You don't want to sit in the dark like this, Mr. Reynolds, do you? Let me open the curtains for you, so you can enjoy the stunning views from outside. It's such a fabulously beautiful day outside today. I really love this time of year. Here in Stowe. But let's not kid. April is out of season for those of us catering for the tourists. People love flocking to this part of New England in winter, for all the skiing on offer, and I can fully understand why. You should have seen how lovely the Green Mountains looked last winter, all covered with snow. They were absolutely beguiling. It's quite understandably a tourist's dream to come skiing here in winter. Last year, me and my husband were doing some renovations to this place, so we weren't open to the public yet. It really did look like a winter wonderland out there, let me tell you. And with the large crackling fires, people will get to thoroughly enjoy this inn. I'm hoping by then business will be booming for us. And I do hope, Mr. Reynolds, you'll join us again in the winter season, as you're welcome here any time. Mr. Reynolds said absolutely nothing. He was a very quiet, unassuming man, and seemed to rather like listening to my voice as I chatted away. Well, at least I assumed he enjoyed it. I understood his wife would chat away at him when she was alive, and he enjoyed listening to her yabbering on, so why not me? I like to be a conversationalist, especially towards a quiet guest like Mr. Reynolds, who needed bringing out of his shell. Mr. Reynolds was our 13th patron who'd booked into the White Owl Inn since we'd opened 3 weeks prior. I was absolutely delighted we'd managed to attract a few people already out of season, when we hadn't even advertised yet. It would take a while before people learnt about our sumptuously cosy inn in Vermont, but hopefully word would spread around quickly, and before long we would do a booming trade, as after all, word of mouth is the very best form of advertising. Let's just say, during the course of our marriage, me and my husband Jordan had been longing to open up an inn for ourselves in Vermont, but it was not to be, as we went through a plethora of rather unfortunate financial hurdles. But when Aunt Bridget died, she left me a sizable amount of money, so that our dream about moving to New England from Buffalo in New York could be fully realized. It was a stroke of good fortune for us when by random chance a rather dilapidated property on a generous acreage of land had come up on the market at a steal, and me and Jordan, we snapped it up so fast we barely had time to even draw breath. It would sadly seem that the previous owner, due to an excessive drinking and opioid addiction, not uncommon in these parts I'm afraid to say, had unfortunately driven his family away from him due to his rampant out-of-control addictions. The man had lived in this house for many years, allowing the property to descend into ruin and rather bad decay, like someone who hasn't used a toothbrush for many years and allowed their teeth to rot in their own gums. Thankfully, a structural engineer assured us the foundations were still very good of the property. We had bought the place and spent the last year or so transforming the house and turning it into the White Owl Inn, with extensive renovations and help from an architect who turned the White Owl Inn into a classical, charming home from home for visitors looking to enjoy some romantic alpine elegance. Me and my husband were both retired, but still in our early 50s, so we were reasonably young. Running the inn was a way of bringing in money for us to support us in our old age, while enjoying the unparalleled beauty of the mountains. It seemed for us to be a win-win situation, and the quintessential opportunity to meet interesting people from all around the globe, who like to visit Vermont in the winter months to enjoy the idyllic scenery on offer and the skiing opportunities at this time of the year so obviously presented. The only drawback, of course, living in these parts is it can get bitterly cold in winter, where temperatures can really plummet to record lows. As we both came from Buffalo, where it can be incredibly freezing during the winter months. Me and my husband Jordan knew how to conquer the demon of the cold to the best of our ability, even though it's never easy, mind you. The small town of Stowe that some describe like a village attracted tourists from all around the world to come skiing here in winter, although some people did visit us out of season in spring and summer, like Mr. Reynolds had done so, and it was something I wanted to actively encourage, as let's not kid, the fall here in Vermont is something spectacular to behold. There is nothing quite like it when the trees allow their autumn foliage to turn into golds and reds. It is nothing short of breathtaking. It was over dinner the previous evening. The old man had opened up to us. Mr. Reynolds was in his 80s, but looked as healthy and robust as someone half his age. But I could see in his drooping shoulders and his sad little crinkled face that was like a road map, it was so heavily lined, that he was far from a happy man. I think unhappiness can really ruin our health, even if it's not visible to the naked eye. Mr. Reynolds told me that he walked regularly, and he seemed reasonably fit. He told us that Stowe was his late wife's favourite small town, which was why he kept coming back to this part of the world, to refresh his memories of the woman he'd loved so very much in life. When I walk down the streets in the village, with all the charming little vintage shops, it's very nostalgic for me, he told me, his face lighting up like a Christmas tree, that for a brief moment I could see a younger version of himself looking straight back at me, almost as if he'd just gone back in time, just for a second. He paused for a brief moment, drew in a deep breath, as if he was aching from the revelry. When me and my wife were younger, my wife would come skiing here regularly. She put me to shame, she did, on the skiing slopes, let me tell you. She was quite the natural in that regard, whereas I looked like a stumbling, clumsy old fool. I was never very good at skiing, and didn't particularly enjoy it either, but I pretended to, just for my wife's sake. What happened to your wife, Mr. Reynolds? I asked. Mr. Reynolds hung his head of grey hair sadly, his face suddenly looking very pinched and rather gaunt. Breast cancer, he said. The first time my wife was diagnosed, she made a full recovery. But the cancer, I'm afraid, came back with a vengeance, treacherously determined to take her down. And within weeks of her second diagnosis, my wife passed. She refused any chemo, you see, which might have prolonged her life for a couple of months or so. But it was an aggressive cancer, and my wife chose quality of life over quantity, if you know what I mean. A lot of people feel like that about chemo, Mr. Reynolds, I said. It can suck the life out of you, I believe. Many people decide they just can't take it, because theoretically chemo is actually a poison. I'm sure it is. It certainly sucked the life out of my wife. I remember her first cancer diagnosis, when she was on that chemo. She wasted away before my very eyes, because she couldn't eat a thing, was permanently throwing up. She lost all her hair, and felt lousy all the time. I think the chemo was killing her more than the cancer. But she did rise above it, and finally got her strength back. But her reviving health was regretfully rather short-lived. She was one of the unlucky ones, I suspect. I wish she hadn't died, and it had been the other way round. I thought I would be the one to go first. I was 3 years older than my wife. They always say women outlive men by 5 to 10 years. I'm afraid I'm not very good on my own. That's why I come to places like your lovely inn, to help keep me stimulated, or I'd probably die of lonely boredom if I sat at home in Queens, wallowing in my grief, and feeling desperately sorry for myself. I can't even bring myself to throw out Molly's things, because it's like admitting that she's really gone, and I can't do that, because I need to believe she's still around me. Mr. Reynolds, everyone grieves differently. And who's to say your wife isn't watching over you? I'm sure she is, I said kindly. When the time's right, you'll be able to deal with her clothes and give them to a charity, perhaps. But don't be hard on yourself. Everyone grieves differently, in their own time, and that's the way it should be. That's the problem, dear. I don't know if the time will ever be right. I don't want to throw anything connected to my wife away. I try to keep myself as busy as I can, so I don't have to think about my wife too much. or I become lugubriously sorrowful. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Reynolds. It can't be easy for you. Well, don't feel sorry for me. It is what it is. Everybody ends up in my predicament. Someone always outlives the other. It's the way it's always been. I felt really sorry for poor Mr. Reynolds, because he seemed so melancholic. It would seem his wife Molly had died 5 years prior, and since then he'd become very lonely, especially as his only adult daughter, of similar age to me and my husband, had moved to Ireland over 25 years ago to get married, and her 3 adult children, that were Mr. Reynolds' grandchildren, had all long since left home, but still lived in Ireland. Mr. Reynolds felt very alone in the world, and who could blame him for that? I didn't know what loneliness was, he told us over the dinner table that night, until Molly died. And with my daughter living abroad so far away in Ireland, it wasn't easy. She wanted me to move there to be with her after my wife passed. But I've lived in America all of my life, and I wasn't about to move away to pastures new. Not at my age, anyway. The change would be such a shock to the system, it might actually kill me, he joked. Well, that's perfectly understandable, Mr. Reynolds. North America is your home. You've made so many lovely, wistfully nostalgic memories here with your wife, Molly. Why would you ever want to leave this place? That's exactly what I told my daughter. You took the words right out of my mouth, said Mr. Reynolds. She said home isn't a place, it isn't a country, it's family. And I suppose she's right to a certain extent. As I pulled back the curtains and plumped up a couple of cushions on one of the settees that had been squashed down from the previous night, where me and my husband had sat down after dinner to enjoy a hearty conversation with Mr. Reynolds, I was delighted the elderly man had really opened to us over that evening meal. It had been so good getting to know this charming gentleman. I glanced up at Mr. Reynolds and flashed him a bright, very warm smile, but I realized he hadn't been listening to a single word I'd been saying. He seemed to continually stare out into space, his eyes shielded behind silver-rimmed glasses that he always wore. I thought the elderly man was obviously lost in his thoughts. Was he thinking longingly about his wife Molly? I privately wondered. Poor man, he really was a tormented soul, grieving her loss even 5 years on. There are some things in life we can never get over or escape. I glanced briefly around the living room, delighting in its elegant alpine decor. I couldn't help rather smugly thinking to myself that me and my husband Jordan had done an outstandingly fabulous job in transforming the White Owl Inn. I knew it was our unique, magic, artistic touches to the inn that had made it feel so warmly welcoming to all our guests. I had industriously picked up some fine collectible pieces of vintage furniture at antique shops all around Vermont, where I'd brought some unique-looking eclectic treasures that had already been admired by the first few guests that had recently stayed at the inn. I had married everything together so resplendently, using rich, warm autumn colours like deep reds, golds, pinks and russets, much like the Vermont countryside itself in fall, to give that inn a warm, cosy, countrified atmosphere. Several people had asked me who my interior designer was. It made me feel remarkably accomplished, as I had decorated the entire inn myself from top to bottom. I did not want to go needlessly splashing money on a designer, when I was naturally quite creative myself. Also with interior designers, they often do things very stiffly, according to a standard, rather regimental protocol that will appeal to a lot of people. And sometimes in that approach, individuality can be sadly lost. I was desirous to make the White Owl Inn uniquely personal, so there wasn't an inn quite like it. I had chosen to call it the White Owl Inn, as on the first night we moved into the inn, when I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink, a white owl spontaneously flew onto the tree branch opposite the kitchen window, where it happily perched, staring at me through its bright yellow eyes. I thought he was the most spectacular bird I had ever seen in my entire life, and the extraordinary bird executed this bizarre, rather incongruous behaviour for an entire week, almost as if it was welcoming us both to the inn. That was when the name for our inn was born. On this very alluring, rather pretty unassuming morning, Shafts of beautiful sunlight spilled lackadaisically through the living room windows, casting shades across the recently renovated wooden floors, where thick, colourful woolen rugs made the living room look so inviting. "Ah, that's better, isn't it, Mr. Reynolds?" I said with a smile that could be heard in my voice. "We can't have you sitting in the dark like this, can we? It's such a lovely day out there. Now, what would you like for breakfast? I'll tell you what I've got. I could make you a continental, with croissants and jams and stuff like that. Or a full English with eggs, bacon, the works. Or an American breakfast with pancakes, maple syrup and crispy bacon. You choose. What would you like, Mr. Reynolds?" Mr. Reynolds failed to answer me. I wondered if he was suddenly hard of hearing. But it was profoundly odd, the way Mr. Reynolds seemed to be staring straight ahead of himself rather absent-mindedly beneath his glasses. Well, so I thought. I couldn't see him very clearly, as a blast of glaring sunlight made me narrow my eyes into a squint. So the shadow of Mr. Reynolds sitting up on the sofa seemed ambiguously obscure. I padded over the thick pile rug towards the sofa where he was sitting. Perhaps he had drifted off into a light sleep, I thought. So I raised my voice in the hope he'd hear me, wondering if I was rude to wake him up from his nap. But then again, if Mr. Reynolds wanted breakfast, I wanted to get on with it, as I had a plethora of chores I needed to do. "Mr. Reynolds, what would you like for breakfast? Mr. Reynolds? Mr. Reynolds?" The man seemed very quiet and was completely unresponsive to me. It was in that moment I knew something was terribly wrong, and seized with a great sense of trepidation, I began to shake Mr. Reynolds rather vigorously. "Mr. Reynolds! Mr. Reynolds, are you all right?" The old man failed to respond, and when his glasses slipped off his face after I had shaken him, where they landed on the pile rug, close up I observed his eyes were vacant and glazed over. "Please, God, no! This couldn't be happening! Mr. Reynolds, wake up! Mr. Reynolds, wake up!" But the man did not respond to me. It was then that I felt for a pulse, and realized how cold he was, and how grey his skin had actually become. My burgeoning hope just plummeted, and I realized Mr. Reynolds was almost certainly dead, and by the look of things he might have been dead for some time, although I couldn't be sure, as I was no expert in these matters. At that precise moment I let out a muted wail that sounded more like a cat being strangled than of human origin, and its piercing shrill rang through the house and got my husband's attention, as after a thumble of desperately fast footsteps dashing down the staircase, my husband finally entered the living room, seemingly relieved to see that I was still in one piece, because judging by my scream, it had made him believe otherwise. "What the hell is wrong, love?" said Jordan, looking flustered. "You scared the bejesus out of me, screaming like that. Don't you ever do that again. I thought you were being killed or strangled to death." My husband looked refreshed after his shower, but the expression on his face showed me that my scream had sent the fear of God shooting through every single cell in his body. I could pick up the citrus notes of his aftershave, and his hair was still damp and neatly combed back. As usual, Jordan looked immaculately turned out, wearing a pair of comfortable loafers and a caramel pair of chinos, with a navy button-down shirt. My husband's thick hair was still as black as a raven's, so he looked more as if he was in his early 40s rather than middle 50s, and it certainly helped that he had a baby face. I, on the other hand, rather clandestinely masked my greyness with a very clever, rather fetching auburn hair dye that I thought looked rather good with my pale skin and blue eyes. And from time to time, I will admit, I did surrender to the enticements of Botox procedures to ensure that the line between my brow that made me look like an angry schoolmistress would be kept at bay. But I never did anything to my appearance too much, as I didn't want to be devoid of any facial expression. "What the hell is going on?" my husband continued. He looked from me to Mr. Reynolds sitting back on the chair, almost as if he was expecting Mr. Reynolds to answer him and to explain what had just happened. I stood in the living room, pointing at the old man. I whispered to my husband, almost as if I was afraid that the very walls of the inn would hear my confession. "Mr. Reynolds, he's dead! He's dead, Jordan! He's dead!" "Dead?" said my husband, looking taken aback by this startling, rather disquieting revelation.
But are you sure?
I'm telling you, he's dead, Jordan, I repeated, putting a hand over my mouth. What are we going to do? I wailed. My husband rushed over to the old man to examine him more closely, and much like I had done, he began shaking Mr. Reynolds and checking for a pulse. He looked up at me to affirm my worst fears.
He's long gone, I'm afraid.
My husband began fumbling around in the pocket of his caramel-coloured chinos to pull out his rather swanky cell phone.
I think he must have had a heart attack. We better call the emergency services at once. Although it's too late for Mr. Reynolds to go to hospital, he'll have to go to the mortuary.
I'm not proud of myself for what I did next, but I couldn't help myself. In my defence, I will say this. For me, opening the White Owl Inn was a dream come true. I was terribly afraid if people learned that someone had died at the White Owl Inn, it could potentially ruin our business. Whether I was right about this, I didn't really know, but it was always better to be safe than sorry. I had my heart set on making this place a huge success. Much as I really liked Mr. Reynolds, I couldn't allow his deceased body in our living room to be the reason people chose other inns over ours when it came to booking arrangements for the winter seasons. You can't do that, I said, grabbing my husband's hand. You can't phone the emergency services. I snatched his cell phone away from him. You can't do it. Well, not yet anyway. We've got to talk about this first.
What on earth are you talking about, love? You're making absolutely no sense. It's obvious Mr. Reynolds has had a heart attack, a fatal one. The poor man has been dead for hours. There's no way we can bring him back now. We need to call the emergency services at once. That's what you always do in a situation like this.
I began to wave a warning finger at my husband. No, you can't! You can't do that, Jordan! I barked at him. Mr. Reynolds is long dead. No one can save him now. If you phone the emergency services and word gets out that Mr. Reynolds died at our inn, imagine how catastrophic that will be for our business, Jordan. It's hardly an auspicious start for us when we've barely even opened our doors to the public. And then this happens.
It's not ideal, admitted Jordan, but we can't exactly do anything about it, can we? The old man chose to pop his clogs in our living room on the sofa. It is unfortunate, but it is what it is. When did you last see him alive? Can you remember, love?
Last night when I went to bed. He was still sitting down here. He was reading a book. I pointed to the Dick Francis book that was lying half open on the coffee table. Mr. Reynolds bid me good night. He said he suffered from insomnia and wanted to turn in later after he read a little more. I asked him if I could make him a cup of cocoa. He said that would be very nice. I made him a warm cup of cocoa with some marshmallows on the top, and I brought it in to him. We talked a little. He took a couple of sips of cocoa, saying it was absolutely delicious. He was saying how he wished his wife, Molly, could have stayed in the inn, as she would have really loved this cosy place and the way we've done it up. Then he went on to say that he'd really enjoyed his walk in the woods yesterday afternoon. He reckoned he wasn't alone on his walk, Jordan. He told me he felt watched all the time and was certain that someone had been following him in the woods. I told him that I was sure that that couldn't be true. He's a nice man, Jordan, but maybe he's a little delusional. There's no way anyone could have been following him. This is private property, isn't it? Unless, of course, we've got an unwelcome visitor camping out there on the land. But that's so unlikely at this time of the year. It's still reasonably fresh in the mornings. No one could be camping out there now.
He told you that, said Jordan, looking rather bewildered. People don't usually imagine that someone is following them, unless they're extremely paranoid, or unless someone actually is. I don't think Mr. Reynolds was ever the paranoid type. The wood grove is very peaceful here. I doubt anyone could have been watching him.
Well, maybe when you spend a lot of time alone and then walk in the woods surrounded by so much indigenous wildlife, if any of that wildlife is paying attention to you, like a bird in the trees, or a squirrel perhaps, maybe you can feel their stares perhaps.
I don't think, love, that would explain the feeling Mr. Reynolds had of being watched, said Jordan. How did he seem to you, love, when you were about to go to bed last night? I didn't hear you because, as you know, I was working upstairs, calculating some figures concerning our business and some of the bills we need to pay. I know over dinner he seemed cheerful enough to me. He talked a great deal about his late wife, and said recently he'd been having vivid dreams of her that made him very happy. I wonder if he had some kind of prognostication, that he was nearing the end of his life. That can sometimes happen to people, you know.
Well, I don't know about that, Jordan. Let's just say last night he was very talkative, quite cheerful really, in a very good mood. When I bid him good night, he was in great spirits and said he'd got to an exciting part in his book and Dick Francis was his all-time favourite author. He did say that. He was like he'd been when he was enjoying dinner with us. I then just retired to bed. All I can say, Jordan, is thank God we have no one else staying at the inn with us at the moment. Imagine if they were to wake up in the morning only to discover that one of the guests had popped his clogs overnight. It would be like something out of a horror movie, wouldn't it? My husband looked at me through his steely eyes, with a rather confounded expression on his face, that surprisingly I couldn't read. I had no idea what he was thinking, but it was as if he was deeply locked in thought.
Well, said Jordan reflectively, let's just say Mr. Reynolds has been dead for quite some time, I think. I see he didn't drink all his cocoa, which is still on the coffee table in that mug. My guess is he must have passed away shortly after you returned to bed, which means he's possibly been dead for about 10 hours or so.
You have to get rid of the body, Jordan. You have to get rid of it. We can't have people learning he died on this sofa in our living room, where guests will be sitting around the fireplace on a cold winter's night. They don't want to think that someone died where they're sitting. Imagine that!
What the hell are you talking about, sweetheart? I can't possibly get rid of Mr. Reynolds' body. Are you absolutely insane? If I do that, it'll look like I have something nefarious to hide. Almost as if in some way I'm responsible for his untimely death.
Don't be silly. I'm not asking you to do that, Jordan. We can take the body to the woods, carry it in there, leave it on the ground. Tell the police we found Mr. Reynolds there. I don't want him in the house, Jordan. I'm sorry. I've worked so hard for this business, and a dead body found on our sofa could literally destroy it. I'm sure when the coroner does her autopsy, she'll say he suffered from a massive coronary heart attack. But at least if he died in the woods and not in this house, I don't think it'll impact our business in the slightest.
You really think it makes such a difference where someone dies?
Of course it makes a difference. A huge difference, Jordan. Tell me something. If you and I were going to stay at an inn in Vermont, and you heard one of the guests had died on the sofa in the living room in one of those inns, how would you feel about booking that inn for your alpine adventure? Wouldn't you prefer to choose another one? My husband was silent for a brief moment, as he thought about my question long and hard. Finally he said,
Well, you've got me there, sweetheart, by the short and curlies. I really don't know how to answer that question of yours. It's a good one. I don't really know how I would react in the circumstances. I guess some people might not be at all bothered about someone dying at the inn. Others won't like it one single bit. You're right, we have to move the body. I can tell the police we both went out for our morning walk. Our guest wasn't up and about, and we assumed he was either sleeping in late or had taken an early brisk walk himself. I think we can get away with saying that. We are going to have to shift Mr. Reynolds' body from the sofa onto a plastic tarpaulin and load him up onto the back of the 4-seated ATV, which I will drive into the woods. We will drag him on the plastic tarpaulin from the ATV, placing him on the walking trail, so it looks as if he collapsed on the ground after having a very bad coronary arrest. I'm warning you, love, a dead weight is pretty hefty, so this is a formidable task for us to undertake. Are you really up for it? Do you really want to do this? I frowned at my husband, as if he was asking a stupid question, and snapped, Do we have a choice in the matter, Jordan? There is no choice. There is no way anyone could possibly know that Mr. Reynolds died in our living room. They just can't. Besides, I'm reasonably strong, and Mr. Reynolds is not such a big man, is he? We will manage one way or another. I understand how you feel, love. Certainly if it means so much to you that we deposit his body in the woods, then we will do just that. Once the body is examined by a medical examiner in an autopsy, all suspicions as to the manner in which he died will be erased, when it is declared that Mr. Reynolds must have had a bad heart attack. Luckily, a medical examiner will be likely to determine the cause of death, which will automatically rule out foul play. All we are doing is moving a deceased body. And that's hardly a crime, is it? Said my husband, sounding as if he was trying to convince himself of this fact. Of course it's not a crime. The man is dead. He's beyond saving now. Poor Mr. Reynolds, I said, looking down at the old man, allowing a couple of tears to now spill down my cheeks. You know, I really liked him a lot, Jordan. He was such a sweet gentleman. And now this has to happen to him. Why does life have to be so desperately unfair? Hasn't the poor man been through enough already, losing his wife? And now he has to die as well. My husband took me lovingly into his arms and held me tightly. He kissed the top of my auburn curls. I think he's probably happy to be gone, love. If I'm being brutally honest. Look at how sad he's been. He's been grieving the passing of his wife for the last 5 years or so. And that's a hell of a long time to be very sad. I think he enjoyed the evening meal we had together last night. You were very good with him, like you always are with our guests. I think it was a release for him, getting his grief off his chest and talking about his late wife. My bet is he's meeting up with his wife now in heaven, and that's going to be one hell of a reunion for him. I'm sure he's in a much better place now, and would never ever want to come back, even if he was given the choice. You really believe that? I asked my husband incredulously. Well, I want to believe that, love, because if this is all there is, then life is a sad lot, is it not? There has to be more to life than just existing for 100 years or a lot less until you exist no more. It would make absolutely no sense, would it, if this was all there was? No, I suppose you're right, I agreed, turning my attention to the deceased body on the couch. I have to say there really was a peaceful expression on Mr. Reynolds' face that I hadn't even observed before, although his body was more like a shell, as his essence had all but gone. I'm so sorry, Mr. Reynolds, to have to do this to you, I said, taking his cold hand in mine and giving it a squeeze. I hope you don't mind us putting you in the woodgrove. It's very pretty in there. It's just if anyone was to find you had kicked your clogs on our sofa in the living room, it won't be good for our business. And, well, our business could descend into oblivion. And I know you wouldn't want that for us, would you, Mr. Reynolds? You're a good man. It's been a pleasure having you to stay with us at the White Owl Inn. We'll never, ever forget you. It was a laborious struggle, heaving Mr. Reynolds' body onto a plastic tarpaulin and then putting him on the back of our 4-seater ATV so that my husband could drive him into the woodgrove. I had no idea that moving a dead body could be such back-breaking work, but it really was. However, this needed to be done. I couldn't imagine the articles in the Vermont Standard or Burlington Post saying, 85-year-old Mr. Reynolds from Queens in New York was tragically found lying dead on a sofa at the White Owl Inn, where he was staying over the weekend. No foul play is suspected. It is believed he suffered from a massive coronary heart attack. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Viceroy, were very sad about his tragic passing, describing him as a very nice gentleman. They have only just opened their doors to the public after a year of renovating the property. It once belonged to the Tucson family and had been left in a dilapidated state. Mr. Reynolds leaves behind a daughter and 3 grandchildren that currently reside in Ireland. He will be sorely missed. This is a very inauspicious start for the couple, hoping to cash in on the tourist industry in the skiing season. Let's just say I doubted that people would be breaking down our doors, even if we offered a holiday special, in the event of hearing such sobering news. No, I couldn't afford any bad publicity. Not like that. I was certain that kind Mr. Reynolds would be quite happy for us to shift his body for a short while anyway, as after all it didn't serve him any longer, did it? It must have been about 9:30 in the morning when we dropped Mr. Reynolds off in the woodgrove, after some exhaustive heaving and grunting on our parts. This was not a job for the faint of heart, and I could only thank God that Mr. Reynolds was a slim man. I dread to think if we would have managed if he had been twice his size. We placed Mr. Reynolds on the walking trail in the woods, yards away from a lofty tree, with branches bursting with brand new spring foliage.
I think we rather successfully made Mr. Reynolds look as if he'd fallen over after having a massive coronary arrest. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it gets very, very exciting indeed, so I hope you join me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.